Have you ever thought you knew something and one day found out what you absolutely knew to be true just wasn't? Ooh, that can be hard, can't it? I mean, there we are, going through life just knowing what we know, and along comes a new way of looking at things that suddenly makes sense. Oh, that's how that works. Or worse yet, you suddenly realize everyone around you is just waiting for you to catch up. My name is Ian Currey, and this is Thinking Out Loud. Come on, let me tell you what I think. How do we know what we know? I mean, these days there's the internet, but growing up, homework projects meant a trip to the library and a browse through an encyclopedia or a history book or two. Back then, we were all looking in the same place for the answers to the questions we'd been set. But of course, these days, the internet is where we turn. The trouble is that all too often, if you dig around a little, you'll come up with answers that can't possibly be right. A little game I like to play is to think of two objects and have a guess which one was invented first. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm thinking about here. Let's take a microphone and a locomotive. Which one was invented first? Now, both those things are interesting to me. There are trains all over this house, and I have quite a collection of microphones too. But which came first? How would we find out? Well, let's cheat and look on the internet. Let's look and see who invented the microphone and when. Now, if you do that, you'll come up with one of several answers. The three most likely answers will be Thomas Edison and Emil Berliner, who are often credited with inventing the microphone in 1877. Alexander Graham Bell is also given credit for the same thing, as is Sir Charles Wheatstone. Alexander Graham Bell, of course, is famous for inventing the telephone. But wait a minute here. When did he do that? It turns out the first telephone was invented in 1876. So if the microphone wasn't made until a year later, that would have been a rather interesting first phone call with no microphones. You can listen, but you can't talk until we invent the talking bit. Should have that done in about a year or so. Something like that. Sir Charles Wheatstone actually made up the word microphone in 1827. So this really is a case of several people having the same idea and eventually one of them coming up with something that worked well enough to get the credit for inventing it. The same thing happened with locomotives, which incidentally were around long before microphones. Once people realized high pressure steam could be relatively safely harnessed, steam engines reduced in size drastically and soon were small enough to propel themselves along a track. George Stephenson is often the name that comes to mind if you ask who invented the first locomotive, but Richard Trevithick, and that's a hard name to say, actually made the first one that worked nicely 10 years earlier than Stephenson's in 1804. Sometimes when people see a need for something and realize it should be possible, the problem can spur several to come up with similar ideas at the same time. Arguments often develop about who got there first or who actually invented what. Radar is an especially good example of this. The idea and the theory behind the idea was developed by some very clever people who published a scientific paper explaining how electromagnetic waves could be bounced or deflected by objects in their path. Heinrich Hertz developed the thinking and demonstrated it was possible, in theory at least, way back in 1886 or 7. It wasn't until years later, right before the Second World War, that anyone really paid much attention to it. Of course, with a war looming, the usefulness of radar became rather obvious. Both sides got on and developed working systems, but the systems were vastly different to each other. Despite using the basic principles of bouncing radio waves off of ships or aircraft to find out where they were, the technology was so different between the two that neither side recognized the other had a working system. Now, the German system was much more advanced, far more like the radar systems we use today. But nonetheless, the English system worked quite nicely too. Technicians looking at the English system, who were familiar with the German system, couldn't believe that it was what it was. It must be something to do with communicating with ships or something. It can't be radar because that's not what radar looks like. We know because we have one and ours is nothing like that. Another example, E equals mc squared. Now that formula has a lot tied up in it, but simply put, in the words of its inventor, the mass of an object is a measure of its energy content. Now, for many hundreds of years, scientists had studied the density and mass of objects. Having done so, they carefully wrote down their results and equally carefully came up with a way of quantifying mass. Basically, they invented practical ways to tell you if you had a pound of potatoes or a ton of coal. At the same time, those clever energy scientists were busily quantifying how much energy was needed to do things. I assume eventually these were the scoundrels who invented how to charge as much as they do for the electricity or gas we use to cook our dinner. The problem was that neither group ever saw that there was a relationship between the two, mass and energy. Einstein did. He realized that there was indeed a relationship between the two, and his clever formula was a way to show the relationship. To this day, many find it hard to understand, but nonetheless, energy and mass are indeed totally linked. Being able to understand one thing and not another is nothing new either. Paul spoke about being able to see one thing and not another. Understanding one aspect of life, but not another. We don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. How weird is that? Fix our gaze on things we cannot see? I mean, that's like looking at a radar system, not knowing what on earth it is we're looking at. Too often, when we don't understand something, we throw it out as being nonsense. That can't be radar. It doesn't look at all like ours. That, of course, is exactly what happened in the summer of 1940. One of the many things that caused the famous Battle of Britain to go the way it did is that indeed those funny-looking towers that couldn't possibly be radar actually were and were working quite nicely. Just because clever scientists couldn't see how it worked or understand what it did not mean it wasn't functional and effective. When Paul says, fix your gaze on things we cannot see, it feels a little like our radar story. Just because we don't understand it doesn't make it any less real. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding. From microphones to steam engines, E equaling mc squared, and radar that couldn't possibly work, recent history illustrates that we are often less capable of working out fact from fiction than we think we are. These days especially, truth is rare and hard to find. Now, faith may seem like a tough option, but next time you have questions about faith, remember that sometimes things aren't all they seem to be. Your perspective and understanding may very well need an adjustment. Until next time, goodbye.